The driver didn't even slow down. He just cranked the lever on the back of his freight wagon, and 350 goose eggs, cracked, stained, still warm, tumbled straight into the ditch like they were nothing, like they'd never been anything. Rowan Mercer stood 10 feet away and watched every single one of them hit the mud. "Rejected lot," the driver said, not looking at her. "Buyer won't take cracked shells. They go bad. They smell. Whole shipment gets ruined." He wiped his hands on his trousers. "You want 'em, lady? They're yours. Otherwise they rot by morning." He climbed back onto his seat and clicked his tongue at the horses and left. And Rowan stood there in the dirt road, looking at 350 broken eggs, all that wasted life. And she made a decision that the entire town of Caldwell Flats would spend the next 6 months laughing at. If this story already has your heart, stay with us. Subscribe right now and hit that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if it moves you, leave a like. It means more than you know. The land had a name before Rowan ever set foot on it, and the name was not kind. Locals called it the Sink. 10 acres of low, marshy ground sitting at the bottom of a natural bowl just east of Caldwell Flats, where rainwater pooled and stayed and turned the soil soft and dark and smelling faintly of iron. The deed that Rowan received from her uncle's attorney described it as agricultural parcel, eastern quadrant, Caldwell Township. But what that document could not describe was the way men at the feed store talked about it, with a specific kind of pity that felt worse than contempt. "Old Mercer's niece got the sink," she'd heard one of them say through the open window of the attorney's office the week she arrived. "Lord, that's not an inheritance, that's an apology." The other man had laughed. Rowan had stood very still on the other side of that wall and breathed slowly through her nose until the burning behind her eyes went away. She was 26 years old. She had $83 in a leather pouch, a canvas bag with 2 changes of clothes, and the deed to 10 acres that nobody wanted. She had traveled 4 days by rail and another half day by hired cart to get here. She had no plan that any reasonable person would have called a plan. She had instead a stubbornness that her mother had always described as her worst quality, and her father, God rest him, had always called her greatest one. She signed the papers and walked out into the afternoon sun and told herself she was not going to cry in the street. She didn't. She saved that for later, alone, sitting on the rotted front step of the small structure on the Sink that the deed called a dwelling, and that Rowan privately called a very ambitious shed. The roof had 2 places where daylight came through. One of the windows had been boarded over from the inside, which suggested that whoever had last lived here had done so defensively. The floor was solid enough, but it sloped noticeably toward the back wall, and when she set her leather pouch down, it slowly slid 3 feet before stopping against a crack in the baseboard. She watched it slide. She picked it up. She set it down again. It slid again. Rowan laughed. Not a happy laugh. More the kind that comes out when the alternative is something worse. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and breathed and looked out over her 10 acres of wet, unloved, unwanted ground, where cattails grew thick along the waterline and red-winged blackbirds sat in the reeds calling to each other in voices that sounded, honestly, like small arguments. "All right," she said to nobody. "All right, then." She was not the kind of woman who made speeches, even to herself. She unpacked her bag. She found a bucket and cleared the worst of the debris from the floor. She spent her first night in Caldwell Flats sleeping on top of her canvas bag because the bed frame was missing 2 legs. And in the morning, she got up and went to introduce herself to the town. Caldwell Flats was not a cruel place, exactly. It was just a practical one. The people there, ranchers, feed merchants, a blacksmith, a woman who ran the post office and also sold eggs, and also seemed to know everything about everyone, had all made their lives by making sound decisions about hard land. They respected soil that yielded. They respected animals that produced. They respected people who knew what they were doing. They did not know what to make of Rowan Mercer. She was too quiet to be a schemer and too serious to be a fool, but she'd taken the Sink, and that said something about her judgment that nothing else she did could quite walk back. When she walked into the feed store that first week and asked about soil amendments for marshy ground, the owner, a wide man named Cleet Burrows, looked at her with the carefully neutral expression of someone trying not to be unkind. "You're talking about the Sink," he said. "I'm talking about my property," she said. He nodded slowly. "You could try lime, I suppose. Cut the acidity some. But that ground, it's wet 9 months of the year, Miss Mercer. Roots don't hold. Whatever you plant either drowns or gets eaten by the blackbirds. What about grass? What about it? Does anything grow there? Naturally, I mean. He thought about it. Sedge, he said, reeds, cattails, some water grass along the edges. It's not nothing, it's not farming land. No, Rowan agreed. It's not. She bought what she could afford, lime, a small amount of seed, some basic tools, and carried everything back to the sink herself because she couldn't afford to hire the cart twice. She had been there 3 weeks when she met Matias Vulkar. He appeared one morning at the edge of her property line. A short, broad man in his 70s with a white beard that grew unevenly and eyes that were pale blue and alert in a way that made him look perpetually surprised by something. He was standing in the sedge, perfectly still, watching the marsh. Rowan watched him watching the marsh for about 2 minutes before she walked over. "Can I help you?" she said. He didn't startle. He'd heard her coming. "You are the Mercer girl," he said. His accent was thick, Eastern European, she thought, though she couldn't have said where exactly. "Woman," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, without apology, and turned back to the marsh. "I am Vulkar. I have the 40 acres north of you. I have been here 22 years, he paused. "I wanted to see who was moving into the sink. And now I have seen." He was quiet for a moment. "You have good sedge grass here. Very healthy. I've been told the land is worthless." "The land is what it is," Matias said. "Worthless is what people call things they don't understand how to use." Rowan looked at him. He was still watching the marsh, his hands clasped behind his back. "You have geese," she said. She'd seen them on his property. Big gray birds moving in loose formations through the grass. "I have geese," he agreed. "Do they do well here, in this kind of ground?" He turned to look at her then, fully, for the first time. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but a recognition of some kind, like he was recalculating something about her. "Come," he said, and walked toward his fence line. She followed him. Matias Vulkar's geese were not elegant creatures. They were loud and temperamental, and occasionally aggressive, and they moved with the kind of blunt authority that comes from knowing you are larger than most things that try to bother you. But they were also, and this was the thing that caught Rowan's attention immediately, working the wet ground along his northern fence line like they were born to it. They cropped the water grass flat. They stirred up insects and small creatures from the soft soil. They left behind, as Matias explained with the calm specificity of someone who had been paying very close attention for 2 decades, a natural fertilizer that was slowly, incrementally, improving his lowest ground. "The wetland," Matias said, "is not a problem for geese. The wetland is where they live, where they want to be." "How many do you have?" 60 now. I started with 4. He looked at his flock with an expression that was not quite pride, but was close to it. "It took time. People here thought I was crazy. They raise cattle, they raise hogs. Nobody raises geese." He paused. "Nobody but me." Rowan looked at the geese. She looked back at her 10 acres of wet ground and healthy sedge grass, and the small marshy basin that everyone called worthless. She was doing the math that you do when you can't afford to be wrong. "Mr. Vulkar," she said, "if I wanted to learn—" "I know," he said. "I have been waiting for someone to ask." He turned back toward his house. "Come inside. I will make coffee. We will talk." She did not tell the town what she was thinking. This was deliberate. Rowan had learned in 26 years that there is a particular kind of person who will talk you out of something not because they know better, but because uncertainty makes them uncomfortable, and your uncertainty, specifically, makes them feel obligated to relieve it by replacing it with their own certainty, which is usually just fear wearing a practical hat. She had encountered enough of those people in her life to know that the right response to them was not argument. The right response was silence and distance, and doing the thing anyway. So she said nothing. She bought a small flock of 4 breeding geese from Matias, spending money she could barely afford, and she set them loose on the sink and watched what happened. What happened was, they immediately began eating the sedge grass and acting like they owned the place, because they did, and within a week Rowan could see exactly what Matias had described. The wet ground that everyone had called a liability was, for these birds, an invitation. She was beginning to understand something. She wasn't sure yet what it was exactly, but she could feel the shape of it, the way you feel the shape of a room in the dark before your eyes adjust. And then the eggs happened, and everything changed. She heard the freight wagon before she saw it. It was a Thursday afternoon in early spring, and Rowan was at the edge of her property checking the water line when she heard the heavy creak of wagon wheels on the road that ran along the south edge of her land. The driver came into view, a thick-shouldered man she didn't recognize, handling a four-horse team pulling a covered freight load. The wagon stopped approximately 40 feet from where she was standing. She watched because there was no reason not to. The driver got down, moved to the back of the wagon, and engaged a wooden lever mechanism on the cargo gate. Rowan had a half-second to understand what she was seeing before it happened. The gate dropped, and 350 goose eggs came cascading out of the wagon bed in a terrible soft avalanche and hit the ditch at the side of the road in a sound that she would not be able to describe afterward to anyone who asked. Not a crash. Not exactly. More like 350 small private disasters happening simultaneously. "Rejected lot," the driver said when she came close enough. He didn't look at her with cruelty. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone who has arrived at a scene they don't need explaining. Buyer in Mill Haven won't take cracked shells. Whole shipment was compromised in transport. They go bad. The smell contaminates the whole storage room. He wiped his palms on his thighs. "I'm supposed to dump them out past the ridge, but this'll do. Ground'll take 'em." Rowan crouched down next to the ditch. The eggs were still warm. She picked one up. The crack ran from the air cell end down about a third of the length of the shell. A hairline fracture, not a break. The membrane underneath was intact. She could feel, faintly, the warmth of a living thing that had not yet stopped. She looked up at the driver. "How old are these?" He shrugged. 2-3 weeks incubation. Started in Delbridge, I think. Long haul." She set the egg down carefully and picked up another one. Similar crack, similar membrane integrity. She checked 5 more. Out of 5, 4 had intact membranes. The math was assembling itself in her mind without her permission. "If I take them," she said, "can I have them?" The driver looked at her with the same expression Cleet Burrows had used, that careful, neutral face of someone who doesn't want to say what they're thinking. "Ma'am, they're trash." "Can I have them or not?" "Sure," he said. "They're yours." He drove away. Rowan was alone in the road with 350 cracked, warm, still viable goose eggs and no plan whatsoever. She sat down in the dirt. She sat there for a full 5 minutes, which was not something she did often. She was not, by nature, a person who sat down in dirt roads and stared into the middle distance. But she was doing it now because she was trying to be honest with herself about something important. What she was considering was not reasonable. It was not practical. It was the kind of idea that would cause Cleet Burrows to press his lips together and Matthias to tilt his head and the woman at the post office to tell everyone within 3 days. But the eggs were warm, and her marsh was empty, and she had 4 geese who had already proven to her that wet, unwanted land was not the same thing as bad land. She stood up. She walked back to the sink and got her bucket. She came back and started moving eggs. It took her 4 trips, and most of the afternoon, carrying eggs in her apron and in the bucket and in her canvas bag with her clothes removed and stuffed under her arm. She was careful. She was methodical. She was also, at one point, passed on the road by 2 men from town who slowed their horses and looked at her with expressions that she chose not to interpret. One of them said something she couldn't quite hear. The other one laughed. She kept walking. By the time she got the last of them to the sink, piled carefully in the hay she'd laid out in the back corner of the shed, surrounded by the only spare blankets she owned. It was evening, and she was exhausted, and she had not eaten since morning. She sat on the floor next to 350 cracked goose eggs wrapped in her blankets and ate the last of the biscuits she'd made 3 days earlier and thought, "This is either the beginning of something or the end of me." Then she went and got Matthias. He came in the early dark, carrying a lantern and a wooden box she didn't recognize. He set the lantern down and crouched over the eggs for a long time without saying anything. He turned several of them, held 2 up to the lantern light, ran his thumb along a crack. "Most of them have intact membranes," Rowan said. "Some do," he agreed. "Some don't." "What's the percentage?" He kept examining them. "Maybe 60. Maybe 65. If the membrane is gone, the egg is gone. Bacteria gets in, embryo dies. The whole thing becomes dangerous to the others. He set one egg aside, then another. You'll lose some, maybe many, but not all. Can we seal the cracked ones, the ones with intact membranes? He looked up at her. With what? Beeswax, she said. I read that some keepers use beeswax on hairline cracks. It seals the shell without blocking the air exchange if you apply it thinly enough. There was a pause. Where did you read that? Matias asked. She stopped. I wrote to a poultry keeper in Pennsylvania 3 weeks ago. When I was starting to think about, she stopped again. About this? He gestured at the eggs. About geese, she said. About whether the marsh could support a larger flock. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. You wrote a letter, he said, 3 weeks ago, before these eggs existed. I write a lot of letters. About geese. About a lot of things. Something in his face shifted. That not quite smile again, but warmer this time. He reached into the wooden box he'd brought and set a small tin on the floor between them. I have beeswax, he said. Rowan looked at the tin. You knew, she said. I knew you were thinking, he said. I didn't know about what, but I brought things that might be useful. He reached back into the box. Also warm sand, for insulation. And a thermometer. Temperature is everything. Too cold and they go dormant. Too warm and they die, she said. They die, he agreed. He looked at the pile of eggs, then at her, then at the shed around them, with its 2 places where daylight came through the roof. We are going to need to plug those holes, he said. I know. And we are going to need to turn these eggs 3 times a day, every day, for the next, he paused, calculating, 3 to 4 weeks, depending on where they are in development. I know. And we are going to need to keep the temperature consistent through the night, which means, I'll sleep in here, she said. He stopped. I'll sleep in here, she said again, with them. I can manage the temperature through the night if I'm here. Matias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, carefully, Miss Mercer, it is April. The nights are still cold. I know, she said. I'm a practical person, Mr. Vulkar. I'll be fine. He looked at her for a long moment with those pale, alert eyes. Then he nodded, once, and reached back into his box. I also brought extra wool blankets, he said, for the eggs. But there are enough for a person too, I think. Thank you, Rowan said. They worked through the night, checking membranes by lantern light and sealing hairline cracks with thin, careful applications of beeswax and setting the viable eggs in warm sand and pulling the bad ones aside without sentiment. By the time the first gray light started coming through the patched roof holes, they had sorted through all 350 eggs and saved, by Matias's careful count, 218. He wrote the number in a small notebook he'd brought. Rowan looked at it. 218 broken eggs that the world had thrown away. 218 chances that a freight driver had dumped in a ditch because his buyer in Millhaven had decided they weren't worth the trouble. She thought about that buyer in Millhaven. She thought about what he'd seen when he looked at those eggs. Not what was inside them, not what was still alive and warm and trying, but just the cracks, just the surface, just the thing that made them inconvenient. She thought about the men on the road who had laughed. She thought about Cleet Burrows's careful, neutral face. She put her hand flat against the warm sand and felt the faint, insistent heat of 218 eggs that had been declared worthless and were not. 3 times a day, she said. 3 times a day, Matias agreed. Starting now? He was already reaching for the thermometer. Starting now, he said. The thermometer read 93 degrees at 4 in the morning, and Rowan was already awake. She had not slept well, not because the shed was cold, though it was, but because she kept waking up every hour or so with the vague, unshakable feeling that something needed checking. So she checked. She pulled back one corner of the wool blanket, held the thermometer near the sand bed, read the number, and adjusted the small tin warming pan that Matias had rigged on the second night, with a length of pipe and a clay firebox no bigger than a bread loaf. It was not elegant, it was barely functional, but it held the temperature within 2 degrees of where it needed to be, and 2 degrees was livable. She tucked the blanket back and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the marsh outside. The red-winged blackbirds didn't start until dawn, But there were other sounds, frogs, and the particular sound of water moving slowly through sedge grass, and once, something larger splashing at the basin edge that she decided not to think too hard about. 2 weeks in. 2 more weeks to go, at minimum. Maybe 3. She turned the eggs at 5:30, working by feel in the near dark, rolling each one a half turn the way Matias had showed her, her hands moving through the sand bed with the careful repetition of someone diffusing something. She'd gotten fast at it. First few days, she'd been so anxious about cracking something further that it took her nearly 40 minutes to turn all 218. Now she could do it in 22. She knew because she'd started counting. There were things she was getting good at that she'd never expected to be good at. She was thinking about this, about the strange skills that desperation teaches you, when she heard footsteps outside the shed. She went still. The footsteps stopped at the door. There was a pause, and then a knock that she recognized. 3 short, 1 long. Matias. She got up and opened the door, and he was standing there in the cold morning with a pot of actual coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd been making, and 2 tin cups and an expression that said he'd been up for hours already. Temperature, he said, 93. I adjusted it around 4. He nodded, satisfied, and came inside. He set the coffee down and crouched over the sand bed and did his own version of what she'd been doing, lifting a corner of the blanket, reading the thermometer, pressing his palm against the sand. He moved 3 of the eggs slightly, which she noticed and didn't comment on. 18 days, he said. 18, she agreed. He poured the coffee. They sat on the floor, which had become normal enough by now that neither of them mentioned it, and drank in a quiet that was companionable rather than uncomfortable. Outside, the blackbirds were starting. My wife used to say, Matias said after a while, that the worst part of waiting for eggs is that you cannot hurry them. You can do everything right. You can do everything perfectly. And then you wait. He turned his cup in his hands. She said it was good practice. For what? For most of life. He drank. She was right, usually. Rowan looked at him. He didn't often mention his wife. She had gathered, from small things, that the woman had been gone for some years, and that Matias had the particular careful quality of someone who has reorganized their life around an absence. How long were you married? She asked. 31 years. He said it plainly, without the soft voice people usually used for that kind of number. She came with me from Brno. She did not speak English for the first 2 years. She learned by arguing with the men at the feed store. He almost smiled. She was not afraid of them. Was she afraid of anything? He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. Drought, he said, finally. She grew up in a place where the rains failed twice before she was 12. She never forgot it. He paused. She always said the land here was too dry, even when it wasn't. Rowan held her coffee. What happened when the rains failed where she grew up? People left, he said. The ones who could. The ones who couldn't. He stopped. They managed as people manage. Badly, and then less badly, and then it rained again. He set his cup down. That is the story of most droughts. Not heroic, just endurance. She nodded. Neither of them said anything about the sky, which had been pale and dry for 3 weeks running, or about Cleet Burrow's mentioning, when she'd gone in for supplies, that the Pendleton Ranch's well was dropping faster than it should be for April, or about the fact that the creek that ran along the north edge of Matias's property was running slower than it had the previous spring. They didn't say it, but it was there in the room with them, the way things are when neither person wants to be the one to name them first. Matias left at sunrise. Rowan turned the eggs again at 9, then ate breakfast, 2 eggs from her 4 breeding geese, fried in a pan, and went out to check the basin. The water level was the same as yesterday. That was something. She stood at the edge of the basin and watched her 4 geese moving through the shallows, and she thought about 218 eggs in a shed, and she thought about Matias's wife being afraid of drought, and she thought, I need more time. I just need more time. She went back inside and turned the eggs again at 1 in the afternoon, right on schedule. She was not going to think about drought until she had goslings. One thing at a time. On the 21st day, one of the eggs rocked. She almost missed it. She was doing the midday turn, working her way methodically through the sand bed when her fingers registered something that her brain took a full second to process. The egg she'd just touched had moved on its own. Not much. A tremor, almost. But she'd been handling these eggs 3 times a day for 3 weeks, and she knew their weight and stillness the way you know the breathing of someone sleeping next to you, and this egg had moved. She put both hands flat on the sandbed and waited. Another one rocked. Then a third. Rowan sat back on her heels and pressed her hands over her mouth and did not make a sound because she was afraid that if she made a sound she would cry. And if she started crying, she didn't know when she'd stop, and there was too much to do. She got up and ran to get Matias. She found him in his upper field mending fence, and she said, without preamble, "They're moving." He looked at her. He dropped the fence tool. He came. They sat together in the shed through the rest of that afternoon, watching, barely talking. More eggs rocked. Then, at dusk, they heard the first sound. A faint, persistent tapping from inside a shell, like something knocking on a very small door. "Pipping," Matias said quietly. "That is pipping. They are working on the membrane." "How long does it take?" "Hours. Sometimes more than a day. You cannot help them. If you break the shell for them, they are not strong enough to survive. They have to do it themselves." She understood that completely. She sat and listened to the small, determined tapping, and she did not touch anything. The first gosling broke through at 2 in the morning. Rowan was awake, of course. She'd been awake since midnight, sitting cross-legged on her bedroll with the lantern turned low, watching the shell she'd identified by sound as the most advanced. The crack appeared as a jagged line around the blunt end, and then a small piece of shell lifted, and then there was a beak. It was gray and wet, and not particularly beautiful. It was the best thing she had ever seen. She sat on the floor of her tilted shed at 2 in the morning, watching a gosling dry and wobble and fall over and get up again, and she thought, you were in a ditch. You were going to rot in a ditch on the side of the road. She thought about the freight driver's face. She thought about the buyer in Mill Haven who had looked at cracked shells and seen only the cracks. She didn't write any of this down. She just sat with it. By morning, she had 19 goslings. The hatching stretched over 4 days. Not every egg made it. She had known this, had been told this, had prepared herself for this, and she still found that preparation had not done much when she pulled a shell apart on the 4th day and found the embryo inside fully formed but still, and had to set it aside and keep working. She lost 31 eggs total before the process was done. Some she'd known about early, the ones Matias had flagged on the first night as questionable, the ones she'd been watching with a specific, uneasy attention. Others surprised her, and the ones that surprised her were harder. But 187 goslings survived. 187. She counted them 3 times because the number seemed wrong, too large, too improbable. She went and got Matias and made him count them independently, and he came up with 192, and they argued about it in a low, focused way for 10 minutes until they realized she'd missed counting the 7 who had bunched up in the far corner under a piece of wool blanket and were invisible unless you lifted it. 187. "Is that—" She stopped. "Is that good?" Matias looked at the shed full of small, damp, already opinionated birds, making a noise that was somewhere between a peep and a honk, and escalating steadily. "For a professional hatchery with equipment," he said, 85% hatch rate from intact eggs is excellent." He paused. "You started with cracked eggs from a ditch. Is that good?" she said again. He looked at her. "Rowan," he said, which was the first time he'd used her first name. "Yes, that is very good." She nodded. She went outside. She stood in the morning air for about 3 minutes and breathed and looked at her marsh and her basin and her wet, useless, worthless land, and the blackbirds were arguing in the reeds, and she thought, all right then. She went back inside to start building a brooder, because 187 goslings needed more space than one tilted shed, and she had work to do. They built the brooder over 2 days, working with lumber she couldn't really afford, and hardware cloth Matias contributed from his own stores. It was a rough structure, 3-sided, open to the south to let in light and air, with a covered section for nighttime warmth. Not pretty, functional. She'd learned to stop worrying about pretty around the time she'd started sleeping on a dirt floor to monitor egg temperature. The goslings went into the brooder on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning 2 things had happened. They had established, with great vocal conviction, that they owned the space, and Rowan had realized that feeding 187 fast-growing goslings was going to require a plan that was significantly more detailed than the one she currently had. Her current plan was, the marsh has good grass. This was true. Her basin and the sedge along the waterline were producing more green mass than her 4 adult geese had been able to eat down, and goslings on good grass grew fast and hard and required less supplemental feed than grain-raised birds. Matias had told her this, and she'd verified it in the letters she'd been exchanging with the poultry keeper in Pennsylvania, a taciturn man named Adler, who wrote in sentences so compressed they were almost codes. Wet pasture best. Supplement with grain during growth. Watch for foxes. Watch for hawks. Watch always. She'd been following his advice since the eggs were in the sand, but even accounting for her good pasture, 187 birds, growing, gaining weight, eating constantly, were going to need more than sedge grass and good intentions. She was working through the numbers one evening when Matias came over and sat down across from her at the table she'd built out of 2 sawhorses and a door and looked at what she was writing. "How much have you got?" he asked. $41, she said, "after the lumber." He was quiet for a moment. "I have some grain I can spare. Enough for 2, maybe 3 weeks." "I can't take your grain." "I am not giving it to you," he said, with a precision that stopped her. "I am lending it. When your birds are grown, you pay me back in kind. Geese for grain. It is a transaction." She looked at him. "You don't need more geese." "No," he agreed. "But I may need something else someday, and you will have something to give." He picked up her pencil and wrote a number on the edge of her paper. "That is what I can spare. Come get it in the morning." She looked at the number. It was enough for 6 weeks, not 3. "Matias." "Morning," he said, and left. She sat at her table and looked at the number he'd written, and she thought about what it meant that the only person in Caldwell Flats who had been straightforwardly kind to her since she arrived was a 70-something immigrant who talked about his dead wife and counted geese with the seriousness of a banker. She thought about what it meant that kindness, when it came specifically from someone who also knew what it felt like to be dismissed by a town that didn't understand you. She wrote him a receipt for the grain, signed it, and left it on his fence post in the morning when she came to collect. He never mentioned the receipt, but she found it, 2 months later, tucked into the wooden box he'd brought on the first night, with the beeswax and the thermometer and the extra blankets, which he had clearly saved. May turned toward June, and the goslings were not small anymore. They were not grown either. They were in the awkward middle phase that Matias called the ugly stretch, where the down was coming out, and the real feathers hadn't come in evenly yet, and they moved in a loose, opinionated mass around the marsh, with the energy of something that has just discovered. It has legs and is intensely committed to using them at all times. They were loud. They were stubborn. 3 of them had developed the habit of standing at the edge of the basin and honking at their own reflections in the water with a focus and regularity that Rowan found baffling and Matias found hilarious. "They think it is another goose," he said, watching them one afternoon from the fence. "They've been doing it for a week," she said. "Don't you think they'd figure it out?" "You would think," he agreed, with the tone of someone who has spent decades watching geese and has stopped expecting them to be logical. The birds were growing, and the grass was growing with them, and the basin was full and the sedge was lush, and Rowan's 10 acres of worthless land was— She allowed herself to think this carefully, not wanting to believe it too hard in case it evaporated. Working. The thing she had seen only as a shape in the dark was becoming visible. Wet land that couldn't grow crops and couldn't support cattle could sustain a water pasture. Water pasture that couldn't feed cattle could feed geese. Geese that nobody in Caldwell Flats raised were, as it turned out, not in competition with anything anyone else was doing. She was occupying a gap. She was filling a space that everyone had decided was empty because they hadn't looked at it the right way. She was thinking about this one morning in early June when she went to the feed store for salt and Cleet Burrows looked at her with something she hadn't seen on his face before. Not the careful neutrality. Something more complicated. "Heard your eggs hatched," he said. She put the salt on the counter. "Most of them." "How many birds you got out there?" She looked at him. "Why?" He put his hands on the counter. "Henderson's down to 40 cattle from 220, he said. "Pendleton sold off his whole herd 2 weeks ago. Barker's corn is done. Soil cracked so bad the roots pulled out." He paused. "We haven't had real rain in 7 weeks, Miss Mercer. The creek's running about a quarter of what it should be. She knew this. She had been watching the creek level from the edge of Matthias's property with the specific, sick attention of someone who has something to lose. "My basin's still full," she said carefully. "I know it is," he said. "That low ground of yours, it collects. Stays wet even when everything else." He stopped. "I'm just saying, people are starting to notice that your land is the only green thing for 2 miles. She picked up the salt. "My birds are 4 months from market weight," she said. "I know," he said. She paid for the salt and left. She walked back to the sink in the early morning heat and looked at her basin and her flock. Her actual flock. Her 187 birds working the wet margins of her land with the casual authority of creatures exactly where they're supposed to be. And she thought about Henderson's 40 cattle and Pendleton's empty pasture and Barker's cracked corn, and she thought about drought and about Matthias's wife, who had always been afraid of it. She stood at the basin edge and watched the water. The water level was holding, just barely, but holding. Around her, the geese kept working the grass. They didn't know about the drought. They didn't know what they meant to the valley, or what they would mean in another 4 months when the first birds reached weight and Rowan would have to decide what to do with them. They just worked the grass and argued with their reflections and made their escalating noise, and the basin stayed wet and the sedge stayed green, and for now, for this moment on a dry June morning with the sky white and rainless above them, that was enough. Rowan went back to the shed and wrote a letter to Adler in Pennsylvania. She told him the hatch count. She told him about the drought. She asked him what he thought a fair market price was for mature geese in a region where cattle operations were failing and protein was getting scarce. He wrote back in 9 days, which was faster than usual. Price goes up when supply goes down. You know this already. Question is what you do with it. Some sell high and make enemies. Some sell fair and make neighbors. Choose carefully. You only get to choose once. She read it twice. She folded it and put it with Matthias's receipt in the wooden box, where she kept the things she wanted to be able to find. Then she went to turn the flock and check the water level and do the 100 small, unglamorous things that keeping a living thing alive requires every single day. Whether or not you feel like it, whether or not the sky looks like rain, whether or not the town has noticed you yet. The town had noticed her. She knew that now. Cleet Burrows's face had told her. And the 2 men on the road who had laughed at her in April were, by June, telling their wives about the woman with the geese on the sink and not laughing when they said it. She didn't know yet what they would do with that noticing. She didn't know if it would be helpful or dangerous or just another form of the complicated human behavior of paying attention to someone only after they've done something you can't ignore. What she knew was this: her birds were alive, her basin was wet, her land was green, and in 4 months she would have 187 geese at full market weight in a valley that was running out of everything else. She turned the flock. She checked the water. She started planning. The first sign of what was coming didn't arrive on horseback or by letter or with any of the dramatic warnings that stories like to provide. It arrived in the form of a man standing at her property fence on a Thursday afternoon in late June, dressed better than anyone had a right to be dressed in the middle of a drought, looking at her geese with an expression she recognized immediately. It was the expression of someone calculating. She had seen it on the attorney who'd handed her the deed. She'd seen it on certain men at the feed store when they talked about land prices. It was the face of someone for whom everything visible was being rapidly translated into a number. The man at her fence was not from Caldwell Flats. She would have recognized him. He was perhaps 50, heavy-set without being soft, with the kind of tan that comes from spending time outdoors in a supervisory capacity rather than a working one. His boots were expensive. His horse, tied at the road post, was better than expensive. He hadn't knocked. He hadn't called out. He was just standing at her fence, looking. She walked toward him without hurrying. "This is private property," she said, when she was close enough. He looked at her with the mild surprise of someone not accustomed to being spoken to that way by someone who looked like her. Then he rearranged his face into something more agreeable and extended a hand over the fence. "Gideon Blackwell," he said. "I have interests in the Millhaven Livestock Exchange and several ranching operations in the Southern Valley." He paused. "I've been hearing about your flock." She did not take his hand. "Miss Mercer," she said. "This is private property, Mr. Blackwell. You're welcome to come back when you have an appointment." His agreeable expression held, but something behind it recalibrated. He was not a man who heard the word appointment from women on failed land. "Of course," he said pleasantly. "I'll do that." He walked back to his horse without urgency. He didn't look back. She stood at the fence and watched him ride away toward the Caldwell Flats Road, and she felt the particular cold of a situation she didn't yet understand but recognized as serious. She went inside and wrote the date in her notebook, June 24th, and under it, one word, Blackwell. She did not know yet what that name was going to cost her, but she wrote it down because she had learned from $83 and a tilted shed and a ditch full of broken eggs that the things you think are too small to matter are usually the things that matter most. She closed the notebook and went to check the water level in the basin. It had dropped another half-inch since morning. Blackwell came back 11 days later, and this time he had an appointment. He'd sent a note through the post office. The woman who ran it, whose name was Vera Such, had handed it to Rowan with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. The note was written on heavy cream paper and said simply that Mr. Gideon Blackwell of the Millhaven Livestock Exchange wished to call on Miss Mercer at her convenience regarding a business matter of potential mutual benefit. It was the kind of language that sounded polite and meant nothing. She wrote back and told him 2 o'clock on Saturday. She told Matthias, who came over Friday evening and sat at her sawhorse table and drank her chicory coffee and said very little for a long time. "You know who he is?" he said finally. "I know he has interests in the livestock exchange and ranching operations in the Southern Valley. That is what he says he has." Matthias set his cup down. "What he has is money and the habit of buying things before other people realize they're worth buying." He paused. "He bought the Kellerman property 3 years ago. The family needed cash, the land looked poor. He paid them low. 2 months later, he sold the mineral rights for 4 times what he paid for the whole parcel." Rowan looked at her notebook, where Blackwell was still written alone under the date of June 24th. "Does he do that often?" "Often enough that people in the Southern Valley know to be careful." Matthias folded his hands on the table. "He is not a violent man. He is a patient one. Those are sometimes harder to deal with." She thought about that. "I'm not selling." "I know you're not." He picked up his cup. "But he doesn't know that yet. And how you tell him matters." She had not thought about this part. She had been so busy thinking about the drought and the basin level and the supplemental feeding schedule and the market price per bird that she had not spent much time thinking about the specific mechanics of telling a patient, wealthy, calculated man that he was not going to get what he wanted. "What would you do?" she asked. Matthias was quiet for a moment. "I would listen first," he said, "all the way through. Whatever he offers, let him finish. Don't interrupt. Don't react. Just listen." He looked at her over his cup. "People like Blackwell, they practice. They have a speech prepared. The speech is designed to make you feel either flattered or pressured before you have time to think. If you let him finish, you hear the whole speech, and you see the shape of it, and then you know where the pressure points are. And then? Then you say no." He set the cup down, clearly, without explaining yourself, because explanations are invitations to argue. She nodded slowly. She wrote "listen first" in the margin of her notebook, then crossed it out because it seemed obvious once it was written. "Will he accept it?" she said. "The no?" Matthias looked at her with those pale, alert eyes. "Men like Blackwell don't accept no," he said. "They wait, and they try a different way. So you say no, and then you pay attention to what comes next." She went to bed that night thinking about different ways. Blackwell arrived at 2 o'clock exactly, which told her something. Punctuality in men like that was a form of control. It was designed to catch you unready, because the person who invited you is always slightly less prepared than they intended at the exact moment the knock comes. She was ready. She'd been ready since 1:30. She let him in and offered coffee, real coffee, because she'd traded 2 dozen eggs with Vera Such at the post office for a 1/4 pound of ground beans specifically for this occasion. And she watched him take in the shed, the tilted floor, the sawhorse table, the wooden box in the corner that still held beeswax and a thermometer, the notebook she'd left open, deliberately, to a page of feeding calculations, so he could see she was someone who kept numbers. He took all of this in without commenting on it, which told her he was disciplined. He sat down across from her and accepted the coffee and said, "Miss Mercer, I want to be direct with you, because I think you're a direct person." She said nothing. She let him go. You have a flock of birds that, by my best count, runs close to 200 head. You have them on land that stays wet because it sits in a natural collection basin, and right now that basin is the only reliable water source within about 3 miles, because we are 7 weeks into the driest summer this valley has seen in 20 years. He paused. Your birds are going to reach market weight in September or October. At that point, you will have the only significant protein supply in a region where cattle operations have been devastated. The question isn't whether your flock is valuable, Miss Mercer. The question is whether you have the infrastructure to turn that value into income before it evaporates. She listened. She kept her face still. What I'm proposing, he continued, is a purchase agreement. I buy the flock at a price that reflects current market conditions, which are favorable to you. I handle transport and sale through the Millhaven Exchange, and I take a processing fee of 30%. You walk away with more money than you'd see in 3 years of trying to sell birds one at a time to struggling local families. He sat back. He was finished. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "What's your number?" He named it. She did the math in about 4 seconds. The number was good, better than she'd expected him to open with, which meant either he was being genuinely generous or he expected her to counter, and the real number was higher. She thought about Adler's letter. Price goes up when supply goes down. She thought about what Matias had said about mineral rights and the Kellerman family. "Thank you," she said. "I'll think about it." He blinked. Just once. A fractional hesitation, the first unguarded thing he'd done since he sat down. He had not expected "I'll think about it." He'd expected yes or a counteroffer. "I'll think about it" gave him nothing to work with. "Of course," he said pleasantly. "I understand you'll want time." "I'll be in touch," she said, and stood up. He stood. He shook her hand. She took it this time, because refusing twice would tell him something she didn't want him to know yet. His hand was dry and firm and entirely confident, and when he smiled at her on the way out, it was the smile of a man who considered this conversation a delay rather than a no. She watched him ride away and then went straight to Matias's property. "He's offering fair money," she told him. "His version of fair. It's not a bad number." "No," Matias agreed, "but it is his number, not yours. There is a difference." He was mending something on his harness rack, not looking at her. "Did he talk about the basin?" She stopped. "He mentioned the water source. That the basin was—" Did he ask about the basin specifically? The drainage? The water rights? She thought back through the conversation with the specific attention she'd been trained into by 3 months of counting eggs and measuring temperature. He said my basin was the only reliable water source within 3 miles. Matias set the harness piece down. "The water rights on that basin," he said slowly, "are attached to the deed, your deed. Yes, not to the land around it, just to the basin itself." She understood where he was going. "Who owns the land around it?" He looked at her. "On the eastern side, between your property and the old Greer pasture, there is a strip of ground about 400 feet wide. It was county land, unseeded, no improvements." He paused. 6 weeks ago, someone bought it." The air in the room changed. "Who?" she said, though she already felt the answer forming. "I don't know the name on the deed," Matias said carefully. "I heard it from Cleet Burrows, who heard it from the county clerk, who was not supposed to say anything." He picked up the harness piece again. "But the person who bought it is not local. They paid in cash. And the strip of land they bought has no value except for one thing. It controls access to the eastern drainage channel," Rowan said. "If someone dammed that channel," Matias said, "or redirected it, your basin would begin to drop. Slowly at first. Maybe not noticeably for weeks." She stood very still. The basin level. Dropping half an inch since June 24th, the day Blackwell had first appeared at her fence. She had assumed it was the drought. She had been watching the sky and blaming the sky. "He was here before he came to see me," she said. "He already bought the land before he made the offer." "I don't know that," Matias said. "I am telling you what I know and what is possible. I am not telling you what is certain. But it's possible." "Yes," he said. "It is possible." She sat down on an overturned bucket that was the only other seating in Matias's barn and put her hands flat on her knees and breathed. She thought about the speech Blackwell had given her, about the phrase "before it evaporates." She had thought that was just language. The general evaporation of opportunity, of market windows. But it wasn't general. He'd known exactly what he meant when he said it. "What do I do?" she said. It was the first time she'd asked Matthias that directly, without softening it into a question about geese or grain or temperature. Just, "What do I do?" He was quiet for a long moment. "You go to the county office," he said. "You look at the deed records. You find out who bought that strip." He paused. "And then you do not react. You keep your birds alive. You keep your basin full as long as you can, and you do not let him know you know." "Why not?" "Because a man who thinks he is ahead will be patient. A man who knows he has been caught will move faster than you can respond." He picked up his needle and the harness piece. "You have 4 months until your birds reach weight. He needs you to sell before then. That means time is on your side, not his, but only if he doesn't know you figured that out." She looked at the floor of his barn. Old straw, dark wood, the particular smell of animals and age and sustained work. "He's going to try to dry me out," she said. "Maybe," Matthias said, "or maybe it is coincidence." He pulled the needle through the leather. "But I would not count on coincidence." She stood up. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, not looking up. She walked back to the sink in the late afternoon heat and stood at the basin edge and looked at the water level and thought about how differently a half-inch looks when you understand what might be causing it. So, the county deed office was in the town of Harmer, 14 miles east of Caldwell Flats. She hired the cart on a Monday morning, told nobody where she was going, and sat in the back of the cart with her notebook on her knee and watched the dry landscape go by and thought carefully about what she was going to find. She found it in 40 minutes of looking, which was faster than she'd expected. The strip of land east of her property, county parcel number 714, had transferred ownership on June 19th, 5 days before Blackwell appeared at her fence for the first time. The name on the deed was Harlan Voss. She wrote it down. She asked the clerk casually if he knew anything about the buyer. The clerk, a young man who was clearly bored and equally clearly not supposed to share information, said he'd never heard of him. She asked if there was an address of record. There was a post office box in Millhaven. Millhaven, where Blackwell had his livestock exchange. She thanked the clerk and went back to the cart. She did not go to Blackwell. She did not write him a letter. She did not react. She thought about Matthias's voice saying a man who knows he has been caught will move faster than you can respond. And she went home, and she was very calm, and she started making a different kind of plan. July arrived without rain. The valley was quieter than it should have been in summer. Quieter in the specific way of places where the ordinary background sounds, cattle moving, farm equipment, the specific working noise of land being used, had stopped, because the operations that made those sounds had shut down. Henderson had sold his last 40 cattle to a buyer from out of the county. Barker was in town most days now, doing fence work for hire because his fields were done for the season. The Pendleton family, Rowan heard from Vera Such at the post office, had sent their 2 youngest children to stay with relatives in the east until the drought broke. Rowan's basin was down 2 inches from where it had been on June 24th. She was watching it every morning now, measuring with a stick she'd marked in half-inch increments and pushed into the mud at the same spot. The drop was slow and consistent, not the dramatic loss of a diverted channel, but the slow bleed of something being incrementally reduced upstream. She couldn't prove it. She didn't have the access to the eastern drainage to check what was happening there, and she was not going to go onto land that wasn't hers and give Blackwell, or Harlan Voss, whoever that was, any reason to claim she'd been trespassing. She was careful, she was methodical, and she was running calculations that she didn't share with anyone except Matthias. At the current drop rate, she had approximately 9 weeks before the basin reached the level where her birds would lose reliable access to water pasture. Her birds would reach full market weight in 11 to 12 weeks. The margin was narrow enough to make her stomach hurt every time she looked at the measuring stick. She needed to sell some birds early, not all of them. Selling the full flock to Blackwell was still a last resort she wasn't willing to go near, but enough to generate cash for supplemental water if the basin dropped too fast. And she needed to sell them locally, directly, not through any exchange where Blackwell had connections. This was the part she hadn't figured out yet. Because selling to struggling local families meant selling at prices those families could actually afford, which meant selling below what the birds were theoretically worth in a drought market, which meant less cash reserve, which created a different kind of risk. She was sitting with this problem on a Tuesday morning in mid-July, watching her flock work the shrinking margins of the basin, when she heard a wagon on the road and turned to see Cleet Burrows pulling up to her fence. He got down from the wagon seat with the careful movements of a man his age who'd been driving a while. He took his hat off when he reached the fence. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Got a minute?" She walked over. "Mr. Burrows." He looked out at her flock. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My wife's family is the Hendersons. Walt Henderson." "I know Mr. Henderson. He's got a daughter, 19 years old, and a son who's 16, and his wife's been sick since February." He turned the hat in his hands. "He sold his last cattle 2 weeks ago. They've got some dry goods and a root cellar, but it's going to be a hard fall if the rains don't come." She waited. "I was wondering," Cleet said, and he said it in the specific way of a man for whom asking is genuinely hard, "if you might be willing to sell a few birds, for a price the family could manage." She looked at him. This was the same man who had said, "That's not an inheritance, that's an apology," through his feed store window in March. She knew he didn't know she'd heard it. She knew it didn't matter. "How many birds is a few?" she said. 6, maybe 8. Enough to get through to October. He met her eyes. "I can pay for them. It's not charity I'm asking. I just don't know if you're selling yet, or what your price is, and I didn't know how to—" He stopped. "I should have talked to you sooner. I know that." She looked at her flock, 187 birds that had been in a ditch in April. "I'll sell you 10, she said, "at cost of feed, not market price. That's what I can do right now." He stared at her. "That's, Miss Mercer, that's less than half what they're worth." "I know what they're worth," she said. "I've been calculating it for 4 months. 10 birds, cost of feed. That's my price for the Hendersons." She paused. "But I need something in return." "Name it." "I need help building a secondary water storage on the north edge of my property. Nothing elaborate. A clay-lined catch basin, maybe 20 feet across. I need it done before August." She looked at him. "I need people who know how to work dirt." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him calculating, not the way Blackwell calculated, with that cool inventory of value, but the honest arithmetic of a man figuring out whether something was fair. "I can get you 3 men who owe me a favor," he said. "Walt Henderson included. He knows earth moving." "Then we have a deal," she said. He put his hat back on. He started to say something, stopped, then said it anyway. "Miss Mercer, I owe you an apology. When you took this land, I wasn't kind about it. I said things." He looked at the fence post. "I didn't think it would amount to anything." She looked at him steadily. "It's amounted to something," she said. "Let's go from there." He nodded. He got back on the wagon. She watched him go down the road toward town, and she thought, that is what it looks like when a person decides to adjust. Not dramatic, not a speech. Just a man turning his hat in his hands and saying what he should have said earlier, and accepting that there was work to do. She went inside and wrote down the deal in her notebook, then wrote down the names. Henderson, Burrows, 3 men, secondary catch basin, north edge, before August. Under that she wrote 10 birds, cost of feed. And under that, because she was honest with herself, worth it. The men came the following Saturday. Walt Henderson and his son, Cleet Burrows himself, and 2 others she didn't know. A quiet man named Pryor, and an older rancher called Dex, who worked without speaking and did twice what anyone else did in a morning. They started at 6 and worked through the hottest part of the day with a determination that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with being men who were used to doing things with their hands and had been sitting idle for too long while their land dried up around them. Rowan worked alongside them. She carried clay and tamped lining and hauled water for drinking and didn't go inside when it got hot, because she wasn't the kind of person who went inside when it got hot. Henderson's son, 16, tall, moving with the awkward speed of someone who hasn't finished growing into his body, worked near her for most of the afternoon. He didn't talk much, but at one point, when they were both resting with their backs against the north fence and drinking water from the same bucket, he said, "How'd you get all those birds from eggs you found in a ditch?" She looked at him. He was not asking to be polite. He genuinely wanted to know. "Beeswax," she said, "and a thermometer, and 3 weeks of not sleeping well." He thought about this. "That's it?" "And someone who knew what they were doing to teach me." She handed him the water dipper. "Most things that look impossible aren't, if you can find someone who's already done it. He drank. He handed the dipper back. My dad said you're selling us birds cheap. For now. Why? She looked at the basin, visible from where they were sitting. Because your dad needed something and I needed something, and this was the way to get both things done. She paused. That's usually how it works, if people can get past pride long enough to talk. He nodded, slowly, with the look of someone filing something away. By evening, the secondary catch basin was roughed in. Not finished, not waterproofed yet, but the shape of it was there. It would hold water. In a week, when the clay dried and they came back to finish the lining, it would hold a lot of water. She fed everyone from her own stores that evening, biscuits and dried beans and the last of the coffee. And they ate standing at her fence in the cooling air. And the conversation was the ordinary conversation of people who have done physical work together, which is comfortable in a specific way that no other kind of conversation is. Pryor asked her how many birds she planned to keep for breeding stock. She said 20 pairs, minimum. Dex, who had not said a word all day, said, "Good number," and went back to his biscuit. She thought about Blackwell, who at this moment was presumably in Mill Haven, waiting for her to get desperate enough to sell. She thought about the slow drop in her basin and the narrow margin between her birds reaching weight and her water running out, and she thought about all the things she couldn't control and the specific few things she could. She looked at the men at her fence, Walt Henderson with his careful, tired face, and his son, and Cleet Burrows, who had driven 14 miles each way to say an apology with his hands instead of his mouth. And she thought about what Matias had said about choosing how you say no. She had said no to Blackwell by saying, "I'll think about it." She had said yes to the valley by selling 10 birds at cost and accepting 3 days of labor in exchange. Those were the same decision, she was beginning to understand. They were both versions of the same answer to the same question, which was, what do you do with something that everyone else has decided is worthless? You find the people who need it. You make the trade that makes sense. You don't wait for a wealthy man from Millhaven to decide the terms. She refilled the biscuit plate from inside, and when she came back out, Henderson's son was showing Matthias, who had appeared at some point during dinner without anyone noticing, carrying a jar of something preserved that his wife had put up before she died. A sketch he'd made of the catch basin drainage in the dirt with a stick. Matthias was nodding. He was pointing at one end of the sketch and saying something about angle. The boy was listening with his whole body the way young people do when they find someone who is actually teaching them something. Rowan set the plate down and stood at the edge of it and felt, for the first time since April, something that was close to, not peace, not exactly, because there was still too much uncertain for peace, but maybe its working cousin. The sense of being in the right place, doing the right work, with the right people around her. It lasted until Monday, when Blackwell came back. He didn't send a note this time. He arrived at 9 in the morning on a Monday, when she was alone. Matthias on his own property, the men from Saturday gone home. And he had someone with him. Another man, younger, with a leather satchel, and the look of someone who worked in documents rather than fields. She met them at the fence. "Miss Mercer." Blackwell smiled. Same confident, practiced warmth. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation. I've revised my offer upward." He nodded to the younger man, who opened the satchel and produced a folded paper. "Given current market conditions, I'm prepared to offer you 15% above my original figure. It's a strong offer. I think you'll agree it reflects the real value of what you've built here." She didn't take the paper. "My answer is no, Mr. Blackwell," she said. The smile stayed, but something behind it shifted. That recalibration she'd seen the first time, but faster now, less smooth. "I'd encourage you to look at the number before—" "I don't need to look at the number," she said. "The answer is no. I'm not selling the flock." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at her basin. His gaze went there with a casualness that was not casual at all, and she understood that he was checking something, the water level. He wanted to see if it had dropped far enough yet. "The drought is going to get worse before it gets better," he said, conversationally, like they were discussing weather. "I'd hate to see you lose birds to dehydration in August when there was a fair offer on the table in July." She looked at him directly. "Is that a prediction or a plan, Mr. Blackwell?" The silence that followed was about 3 seconds long. In those 3 seconds, she watched his face with the attention she'd developed for egg membranes and thermometer readings and basin water levels, looking for what was actually there rather than what was presented. What she saw was a man who had just been told, without being told, that she knew. Not everything. Not the deed in Harlan Voss's name and the parcel number and the post office box in Mill Haven, but enough. She knew enough, and he could see that she knew, and the speech he'd prepared did not have a section for this. "Good day, Miss Mercer," he said. He turned and walked back to his horse, and the younger man with the satchel followed him, and they rode away down the road toward Caldwell Flats without looking back. She stood at the fence with her hands in her pockets and watched them go, and she was shaking, which she had not expected. Not fear exactly, more the particular physical aftermath of holding yourself completely still and completely in control for 4 minutes that felt like 40. She went inside and sat down on the tilted floor. She sat there for a while. Then she got up, because there was always something to do, and she went to check the measuring stick in the basin, and the water had dropped another 1/4 inch since Friday, and she wrote it in her notebook, and she went to feed the flock, and the flock was loud and opinionated and entirely unconcerned with Gideon Blackwell, and that more than anything else settled her. She had not sold. She had not panicked. She had not let him see her shake. She had, she realized, done exactly what Matias had told her to do. She was going to need to figure out what came next, and she was going to need to figure it out before Blackwell did. And she had a narrow margin and a dropping water table and a secondary catch basin that wasn't finished yet, and 187 geese who needed 10 more weeks to reach weight. She turned the flock toward the wettest part of the basin. She started thinking. The letter arrived on a Wednesday, and it was not from Blackwell. It was from the Caldwell Township Water and Land Commission, written on official stationery in the careful, impersonal language of bureaucracy, and it informed Miss Rowan Mercer that a formal complaint had been filed challenging the private designation of the water basin located on parcel 7112, Eastern Caldwell Township, on the grounds that said basin constituted a naturally occurring public water source and therefore could not be exclusively controlled by a private landowner during a declared drought emergency. A hearing had been scheduled for August 14th, 3 weeks away. Her presence was requested. Her response to the complaint was required in writing within 10 days. She read it twice at the kitchen table, the real table now, 4 legs, level, that Henderson's son had helped her build in July as part of an ongoing informal arrangement where he came twice a week to help with the flock, and she fed him and taught him what she knew. She read it twice and then set it down and looked at it from a slight distance, the way you look at something you want to see clearly without your own reaction getting in the way. Then she picked it up and walked to Matias's property. He was in his barn. She handed him the letter without saying anything. He read it once, slowly, and handed it back. "Harlan Voss," he said. "His name is not on it," she said. "The complaint is anonymous, filed through the commission. Anonymous complaints to public commissions don't happen without help," Matias said. "They require someone who knows the process, someone who has used it before." He picked up what he'd been working on before she came, a cracked fence brace he'd been soaking in water to swell the wood back together. Blackwell has used the Water Commission before, in the Southern Valley, 3 years ago. He filed a public access claim on a private well that sat on land he wanted. The family sold before the hearing. Rowan felt the specific cold of a plan becoming visible all at once, the way a shape in fog resolves when you get close enough. The land purchase, the drainage restriction, the offers, the escalating offers. And now this, a legal mechanism that didn't require him to threaten her directly or offer her a penny, just tie her up in a process that would take weeks and cost her money she didn't have and create enough uncertainty that selling started to look like relief. "He's been planning this since before he came to see me the first time," she said. "Probably before he bought the strip of land," Matias agreed. "He identifies the asset, he secures the leverage, he makes the offer. If the offer fails, he applies the leverage. If the leverage fails, he set the fence brace in the water trough. He has not had leverage fail yet, as far as I know." She sat down on the same overturned bucket she'd used in July, because there was still no other seating in Matias's barn. "What does the hearing actually mean? If they rule against me, can they take the basin?" "They cannot take what you own," he said carefully, "but they can rule that you cannot restrict access to it. If the basin is declared a public water source, anyone can use it. Blackwell can drive his cattle onto your land. I don't have a fence on the east side. No. And if he puts cattle on your water, your flock loses its pasture, your land gets churned to mud, and your birds are finished." He paused. "He does not need to take the basin. He just needs to make it unusable for you. She sat with this. Outside, she could hear her flock somewhere in the distance. That particular chorus of sound that she could now read the way she'd learned to read weather, knowing which calls meant content and which meant agitation. "I need a lawyer," she said. "Yes." "I don't have money for a lawyer." "No," he agreed, "but you have something a lawyer might want." She looked at him. "The man who practices in Harmer," Matthias said. "Abelson. He has a small farm east of town, mostly dry ground. His wife keeps a kitchen garden that she's been fighting all summer." He looked at the trough. "He came to the feed store 2 weeks ago asking about water access. Cleet told me." "You think he'd take birds in exchange?" "I think he might take birds and water access in exchange, if you can offer him a reliable source for his wife's garden through the rest of the drought." He looked at her. "That is worth more to some people than money right now." She thought about Adler's letter. Some sell high and make enemies. Some sell fair and make neighbors. She had been building neighbors for 2 months. Henderson, Burroughs, Pryor, Dex, Henderson's son, who now came twice a week and had started calling her flock by individual names that she pretended not to find both ridiculous and touching. She had been building a different kind of resource than the one Blackwell was trying to buy. She was going to need to find out if it was enough. "Can you come with me to Harmer?" She said. "Thursday," he said. "I cannot go Wednesday." "Thursday," she agreed. She walked back to her property and fed the flock and checked the basin, 4 inches down from June 24th now, steady and slow and deliberate. And then she sat at her level table and wrote a list of every person in Caldwell Flats who had dealt with her directly since April, who had bought birds, who had worked on the secondary basin, who had helped her with any part of the operation, and what she had given them in return. The list was longer than she expected. She hadn't noticed it accumulating. She'd been too focused on the eggs, the temperature, the feed schedule, the basin level, Blackwell. Too focused on the threats to track the other thing that had been growing alongside them. But there it was on paper, 14 names, 14 people who had exchanged something with her that was not pity and not charity and not the complicated guilt of a community that had dismissed someone who turned out to matter. Just transactions, honest ones, on both sides. She looked at the list for a while. Then she started writing letters. Abelson was a short, precise man in his 60s who wore his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead even when he wasn't reading, and who listened to Rowan's explanation of the situation with the still, focused attention of someone who has trained himself to hear what's actually being said rather than what he expects to hear. She told him everything. The deed records, the Harlan Voss parcel, the drainage calculation, the offers, the letter from the commission. She had it all organized in her notebook, which she'd brought, and she showed him the dates and the numbers without editorializing, because she wanted him to see the shape of it himself rather than receive her interpretation of it. He saw it. She could tell by the way his jaw tightened on the date of the Voss land purchase, 5 days before Blackwell's first visit, and then released as he moved on to the commission letter. "Anonymous complaint," he said. "Yes." "Through the Water and Land Commission." He took his glasses off his forehead and put them on properly and read the letter again. "This is a drought emergency provision. It was written for genuine public necessity, springs, rivers, shared wells. It was not written for private basins on private land where the owner has made documented investment improvements." He looked up. "But it has been used for exactly this purpose before. The Commission is not sophisticated enough to distinguish between the cases, and they default to access over restriction when there's political pressure." "Is there political pressure here?" "Anyone with business connections in the Millhaven Exchange has political connections in this county," he said, with the flat matter-of-factness of someone stating geography. "The question is not whether Blackwell has influence with the Commission. He probably does. The question is whether the legal record is clear enough that influence alone can't override it." "Is it?" He thought for a moment. "Your deed is clean? Transferred directly from my uncle. No liens, no competing claims, surveyed and recorded. The basin is wholly within your property lines?" "Yes." "The drainage channel runs from the eastern strip, the Voss parcel, into my basin, but the basin itself is entirely mine." "The drainage channel." He set the letter down. "If someone has interfered with that channel, redirected or restricted it, That is potentially actionable as interference with the water right. Do you have any evidence of modification? She had been waiting for this question. She reached into her notebook and removed a folded page. A diagram she'd drawn from memory of the eastern drainage, with measurements she'd taken on 2 visits to the fence line of the Voss parcel. Observations of water flow, written in her notebook on specific dates starting in late June. She had not trespassed. She had observed from her own property line and from the public road. She slid the page across his desk. He studied it. It was very still in the way that meant he was thinking hard. This shows a reduction in channel flow beginning around the last week of June, he said. Consistent with the date the Voss parcel transferred ownership, she said. He looked at her over his glasses. You put this together yourself. I keep careful records, she said. I learned it from managing eggs. A beat of silence, and then he made a sound that was almost a laugh. Miss Mercer, I'll represent you at the hearing. He named a fee, modest, half what she'd feared, and she named a counteroffer, half the fee in cash, half in birds and water access for his wife's kitchen garden through September. He accepted without negotiating, which told her either that the water access was worth more than she'd calculated, or that he found something in the situation that appealed to him beyond the fee. She suspected it was both. On the way home, sitting in the back of his cart with Matias, while the Harmer rode unreeled behind them, she said, He's going to win the hearing, isn't he? Abelson. Matias considered this with his characteristic seriousness. He is a good lawyer, he said, but a good lawyer and a right case do not always win a hearing when the other side has pressure on the commission. He looked at the road. What wins a hearing is when the commission is more afraid of the room than they are of the man filing the complaint. She understood. I need the room, she said. You need the room, he agreed. She thought about her list, 14 names. She thought about Henderson's son who came twice a week and had named her Geese. She thought about Dex, who never spoke but worked twice as hard as anyone else. She thought about Vera Such at the post office, who knew everything about everyone and had been, Rowan realized now, quietly routing relevant information in her direction for months. Cleet's comments about the creek level, the Henderson family's situation, the news about Barker's failed corn, all of it through Vera, who had never once identified herself as being on Rowan's side, but whose information had consistently been useful. She got home at 4 in the afternoon and went directly to the post office. Vera Such looked up from behind her counter with an expression that was, as always, impossible to read entirely. She was a woman in her 60s, with sharp eyes and the posture of someone who has spent decades deciding what to say and what to hold. Miss Mercer, she said. Mrs. Such. Rowan set both hands on the counter. I have a hearing in 3 weeks, August 14th, in Harmer, and I think some people in this valley might want to be there. Vera looked at her for a moment. Might they? She said. I'm not asking for anything specific, Rowan said. I'm just telling you about the hearing. She paused. You know everything that goes on in this town. You knew about the Henderson family before I did. You knew about the Pendleton children. You know what this drought has done to people here. She looked at Vera directly. You probably know things about Gideon Blackwell and his connection to the Water and Land Commission that I don't know yet. Something shifted in Vera's expression. Not surprise. Something more like decision. The commission chairman, Vera said carefully, has a brother-in-law who supplies hay to the Millhaven Livestock Exchange. She straightened a stack of envelopes that didn't need straightening. That's public information, if anyone thought to look. Is it? Rowan said. The kind of thing that might matter at a public hearing, Vera said, if someone brought it up. Someone like a well-informed member of the community, Rowan said. Someone like that, yes. Vera picked up her envelope stack and moved it 6 inches to the left. I'll see what I can do about getting the word out that there's a hearing. People should know what's happening on that commission. It's their water, too, after all. Rowan looked at her. Thank you, Mrs. Such. I haven't done anything yet, Vera said, which was a technically accurate statement that meant the opposite of its words. Rowan went home and fed her flock and checked the basin, 4.5 inches now, and started preparing for August 14th. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the most stretched she had ever felt, and she had felt stretched before. She sold 12 more birds, carefully, specifically, to families who needed them and could pay what they could pay, which in 3 cases was less than cost, and in 1 case was nothing at all. The Barker family. She had not planned to give the Barkers anything, But she had gone to check on the drain calculation one afternoon and taken the long road past their property, and she had seen Mrs. Barker in the yard with that particular stillness that people have when they are trying not to be seen to be struggling. And Rowan had stopped the cart and gone in and come out an hour later with an agreement to deliver 6 birds on Friday. She did not write it in her ledger as charity. She wrote it as an advance against future settlement, which was a fiction they both understood and both needed. The secondary catch basin was finished. Dex had come back unprompted the second week of August with his tools and spent a day waterproofing the lining and was gone before she could figure out what to offer him, so she left a bird dressed and wrapped at his gate, and he left a note on her fence post the next morning that said simply, "Good enough," which from Dex, Matias assured her, was high praise. The water in her main basin was 5 inches below June 24th levels. Still functional, still enough for the flock, but the margin was now close enough that she woke up some nights and lay in the dark, doing arithmetic that always ended in the same place. She needed the hearing to go right, and she needed rain, and she only had any influence over one of those things. She went over her notes with Abelson twice, once in his office and once at her kitchen table, where he drank her coffee without commenting on its quality and went through every document she had, page by page, with a red pencil and the focused precision of a man preparing for something he intended to win. He had found, through his own research, 2 previous cases where Blackwell or entities connected to him had used the drought emergency provision to pressure landowners. Neither case had gone to a full hearing. Both families had sold. That meant there was no legal record of the tactic being challenged, which was both a problem and, Abelson said, an opportunity. If we challenge it cleanly and win, he said, it establishes a record. It makes the tactic harder to use again. He looked at her over his glasses. Which means Blackwell has more reason to prevent a clean hearing than he normally would. What does that mean practically? It means he may try to settle before August 14th, Abelson said. He may make you an offer large enough to be hard to refuse. I'm not selling the flock, she said, for what felt like the 15th time since April. I know, he said. I'm telling you because you need to be ready for the pressure. It will come quickly, and the number will be designed to make you feel foolish for saying no. He paused. Are you ready for that? She thought about a shed with 2 holes in the roof and a tilted floor. She thought about 350 eggs in a ditch. She thought about sitting in the dark at 2 in the morning, listening for the sound of something tapping on the inside of a shell. Yes, she said. The offer came on August 10th, 4 days before the hearing. It was delivered by the younger man with the leather satchel. Blackwell didn't come himself this time, which told her he was either confident or rattled, and she spent a moment trying to determine which. The number on the paper was nearly double the original offer. It was more money than she had ever seen in a single figure. It was enough to buy real land, better land, somewhere with a house that didn't slope. She held the paper for a long time. She was not going to pretend it was easy to say no to that number. It was not easy. It was the hardest thing she'd done since she sat in the dirt road in April, deciding whether to carry 350 broken eggs to a tilted shed with no plan. She stood in her kitchen and she felt the pull of it, the weight of all the uncertainty and the basin dropping and the narrow margin and the months of not sleeping well and the absolute knowledge that one bad August could end everything she'd built. She set the paper down. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "No thank you, Miss R. Mercer," and sent it back with the young man, who looked at her like she'd said something in a language he didn't speak. Then she went outside and threw up behind the shed, which she told nobody about. Then she washed her face and went to feed her flock. August 14th was a Thursday, and Rowan arrived at the Harmer Town Hall 40 minutes early. The room was smaller than she'd imagined, a low-ceilinged hall with wooden benches and a raised platform at the front where the 3 commission members sat behind a long table. The commission chairman was a pale, narrow-shouldered man named Fitch, who had the look of someone who did not enjoy being looked at directly. The other 2 members Rowan didn't know. Abelson was already there, arranging papers at the respondents' table. He looked up when she came in and gave a single, brief nod that meant, "We are ready." The complainant's representative, not Blackwell, a lawyer from Millhaven named Greer, who wore a suit that cost more than Rowan's catch basin, was at the other table. He did not look at her. And then the people started coming in. She had not known exactly who Vera Such had spoken to or what she had said. She had trusted Vera with the information and trusted that Vera understood what it was for, and then she had let it go, because there are things you cannot manage, and trying to manage them anyway is a waste of energy you need for other things. So she had let it go and focused on the basin and the flock and the documents and Abelson. She had not expected 23 people. They came in ones and twos and sat on the benches behind her, and she recognized most of them: Henderson, his son, Cleet Burrows, Pryor, Dex. Mrs. Barker, who was holding her hat in her lap and watching the commission table with the expression of someone who has decided to be here regardless of how it feels. Two men she knew only slightly, neighboring ranchers from the north side of the valley. And Vera Such herself, sitting in the second row with her hands folded and her face absolutely neutral, and her eyes on Chairman Fitch, like a woman who has decided to be impossible to ignore. Matias came in last, 5 minutes before the hearing started, and sat beside Rowan at her table without being invited, which Abelson looked at for a moment and then accepted without comment. Blackwell was not there. Greer, the Millhaven lawyer, represented the complaint. This told Rowan that Blackwell had either calculated that his absence would look more powerful than his presence, or that he had not anticipated the room looking the way it looked, and had decided at the last minute that being physically associated with this particular hearing was not something he wanted. Chairman Fitch opened the session and looked at the room with visible discomfort. Greer opened the complainant's argument. It was polished and legal and almost entirely constructed of abstractions: public necessity, drought emergency provisions, equitable access, with almost no specific reference to anything local or personal. It was a brief designed for a commission that would be looking at paper rather than people. The commission was not only looking at paper, Abelson responded. He was not flashy, he was specific. He walked through Rowan's deed, the improvement history, the documented basin depth and water rights, the measurement record she'd kept since June. Then he put the Voss parcel deed transfer on the table, June 19th, 5 days before Blackwell's first visit to Rowan's property. And he said plainly, "The commission is being asked to declare a private water source public. We would ask the commission to consider who benefits from that declaration and why the complaint was filed anonymously by a party with documented financial interest in acquiring the land to which this water is attached." Chairman Fitch shifted in his chair. Greer objected to the characterization. Abelson said, "The relationship between the anonymous complainant and the purchaser of parcel 7 to 114, Harlan Voss, the strip of land immediately east of Miss Mercer's property, acquired 5 days before the first purchase offer was made to Miss Mercer, is a matter of public record that the commission is entitled to consider." The room was very quiet. Vera Such raised her hand, which was technically not permitted in a commission hearing, but Chairman Fitch, who was looking increasingly like a man who wished he were somewhere else, acknowledged her. "I would like to note for the record," Vera said, in her precise, caring voice, "that the commission chairman's brother-in-law supplies hay to the Millhaven Livestock Exchange, which is the primary business of Mr. Gideon Blackwell." She paused. "That is also a matter of public record, if anyone thought to check." The room did not erupt. It got quieter, if anything, the specific quiet of 23 people all deciding at the same moment to pay close attention. Chairman Fitch's neck had gone red. "That is an inappropriate—" "Is it inaccurate?" Vera asked. The silence stretched. Walt Henderson stood up without asking. He was not a tall man, but he stood like one. "I want to say," he said, addressing the commission with the deliberate manner of someone who has spent a long time deciding what he's willing to say in public, "that Miss Mercer sold my family birds at cost when we had nothing left and asked for labor in return, not charity. She fed people in this valley who were failing, her land, her water, her flock. That is what kept the eastern part of this valley from losing everything this summer." He looked at Fitch directly. "I don't know what this commission was told about why that hearing needed to happen. But I know what's true about her land and her water and what she's done with it, and I thought someone should say it out loud." He sat down. Fitch was silent for a moment. He looked at Greer. Greer was looking at his papers with the focus of a man who has realized the room has changed in a way his preparation didn't account for. Two more people spoke, Cleet Burrows, briefly and practically, about the basin's function in the local water table, and Pryor, who turned out to have surveying experience and produced a hand-drawn map of the eastern drainage channel and the Voss parcel that illustrated, clearly and specifically, exactly what a dam or redirection at that point would do to Rowan's Basin over 8 weeks. "This is consistent with the recorded measurements," Abelson said, placing Rowan's notebook measurements beside Pryor's map. The basin has dropped 5.5 inches since the Voss parcel was acquired. The drought accounts for approximately 2 inches of that. The remaining 3.5 inches is consistent with reduced channel inflow. Greer objected again. Abelson noted that the objection was available for the record. Fitch called a recess. Rowan sat at her table while the room moved around her, and Matias put a cup of water in front of her that had appeared from somewhere and said nothing, which was exactly right. Abelson sorted his papers. Greer, at the other table, was writing something quickly on a page, and she could see from the angle of his pen that it was not notes. It was a letter. She thought, he is writing to Blackwell. She thought, Blackwell did not know the room would look like this. She looked at the 23 people on the benches behind her, Henderson and his son, Dex, who had come and sat in the back row and was looking at the ceiling with his arms crossed and his jaw set, Mrs. Barker with her hat still in her lap, Vera Such, who had not moved and whose expression had not changed and who had, with one precise sentence, shifted the weight of the entire room. 14 names on a list. 14 people who had made transactions with her in good faith, who had given something and received something, who were here not because she had asked them to be loyal, but because she had given them reasons to be. Blackwell had tried to buy loyalty, or manufacture necessity, or create enough pressure that loyalty became irrelevant. He had not tried to earn it, because men like him didn't generally need to. The commission came back from recess in 18 minutes, which was fast. Fitch read from a paper in front of him in the flat tone of someone reading something they did not write. The complaint was found insufficient to meet the statutory standard for drought emergency public access provisions. The basin at parcel 7112 was confirmed as a private water resource with documented improvement investment. The complaint was dismissed. Greer packed his satchel. I was out the door before Rowan had fully processed what Fitch had said. Abelson put his hand on the table between them. Not a dramatic gesture, just a flat palm, steady. That's it, he said quietly. She looked at the dismissed complaint on the table. That's it, she said. Behind her, she heard Walt Henderson say something to his son in a low voice, and the son said something back that she couldn't make out, and then somebody clapped. A single, awkward, genuine clap from somewhere in the back row that might have been Pryor, and then it stopped, because this was a commission hearing and not a theater, and the awkwardness of it was somehow better than anything polished would have been. Matias was already standing. He picked up his hat and put it on and looked at her with those pale, alert eyes that had been looking at her since the morning he appeared at her fence line in the sedge grass, and said, "Worthless is what people call things they don't understand how to use." "Come," he said. "We should get back. The flock needs turning." She laughed. It came out wrong, too sharp, too sudden, the laugh of someone whose body has been holding tension for 3 weeks and has just been informed it can stop. She pressed her hand over her mouth, and Matias waited with the patience of a man who has been waiting for things his entire life. She collected herself. She thanked Abelson, who accepted it briefly and said he'd send a summary of the proceeding in writing and expected the remaining balance in birds at her earliest convenience. She shook hands with Vera Such, who squeezed her hand once and said, "The hall record will note who was in the room today. That matters more than people think." She said a few words to Henderson, to Cleet, to Pryor. She nodded to Dex, who nodded back and did not seem to feel that anything further was required. And then she walked out of the Harmer Town Hall into the August afternoon and stood in the heat for a moment and breathed. The sky was the same dry white it had been for 9 weeks. No change there. The basin would still be 5.5 inches down when she got home. She still had 10 weeks until her birds reached full weight, and she still had to figure out the final market arrangements, and the Voss parcel was still there, the drainage was still restricted, and Blackwell had lost this round, but men like him did not stop because of one hearing. She knew all of this. She stood in the August heat and knew all of it, and she was still standing, and so was her flock, and so was her basin, and so was the secondary catch basin that Dex had lined and waterproofed without being asked. Matias came out and stood beside her. "You did well in there," he said. "Vera did well in there," she said. "Abelson did well. Henderson did well. Pryor did well." "Yes," he agreed. "That is what doing well looks like. You did not do it alone." He paused. "That is also you doing well." She looked at him. He was watching the road in that way he had, like he was reading something in the distance. "My wife," he said, "would have liked you." She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that would be adequate, and she'd learned from Matthias that the right response to inadequate silence was to leave it alone. They walked to the cart. They drove home, and the sky above the dry valley was still white and rainless, and her basin was still dropping, and Gideon Blackwell was somewhere in this county recalculating, and none of that had changed. But 23 people had driven to Harmer on a Thursday and sat in a low-ceilinged room and said, "This is not right, and we are here, and we are saying so." That had changed. That, Rowan thought, as the sink came into view and her flock's noise reached her before she could see them, that was the kind of thing that didn't unhappen. She climbed down from the cart and went to check the basin, and then she went to turn the flock, and the flock was loud and entire and hers. The rain came on a Saturday in late September, and it came without warning. No clouds building over 3 days. No shift in the wind that people in the valley had learned to read as a sign. Just a Thursday sky that was the same dry white it had been since June, and a Friday that was the same. And then Saturday morning, Rowan woke up at 5:30, as she always did, and heard something on the roof of her shed that her brain took a full 3 seconds to identify because it had been so long. Rain. She lay on her back and listened to it for a moment without moving, because she wanted to be sure she was actually hearing it and not doing the thing that desperate people do where they hear what they need to hear in neutral sounds. But it got louder, and she could smell it, that specific smell of dry ground receiving water, which is one of the most distinct smells there is and cannot be confused with anything else. And she got up and opened the door and stood in it. It was not a drizzle. It was rain, real rain, the kind that comes with intention, drumming on the dry sedge and pocking the surface of the basin and running in small, urgent channels along the ground where the earth was so cracked and hard that it couldn't absorb fast enough, and the water moved across the surface looking for somewhere to go. She stood in it until she was wet through. Then she went inside and sat on the edge of her bed and put her face in her hands and stayed like that for a while. Not crying exactly, something adjacent to it. The particular release of a body that has been holding tension for so long it has forgotten what neutral feels like and is now trying to remember. She had made it, barely, and not alone, and with margins that she would not want to repeat, but she had made it to the rain. The basin, when she checked it at 6, was already rising. By mid-morning, it had recovered an inch. By evening, it had recovered 3, and the secondary catch basin that Dex had waterproofed was filling from runoff for the first time, and her flock was moving through the wet pasture with the specific, satisfied energy of birds who have been working reduced ground and have suddenly been given room. She went to tell Matthias, but he was already at his fence watching the sky with an expression she couldn't quite name. "It's raining," she said. "I can see that," he said. She leaned on the fence beside him. They stood together in the rain for a while without talking, which had become, over 6 months, one of their more comfortable modes. "She would have cried," he said, eventually. Rowan glanced at him. He was still looking at the sky. "Your wife," she said. "She never got used to it, the rain coming back." He was quiet for a moment. Even in years when the drought was not severe, when the summer just ran dry for a few weeks the way it does. When the rain came, she would stand at the kitchen window and cry a little. He turned the collar of his jacket up. "I used to think it was excessive. Now I understand it better." Rowan looked at the basin, filling with rain she had been waiting for since June. "I almost sold," she said. Matthias looked at her. "The second offer. The number he sent on August 10th. She shook her head. "I threw up behind the shed after I said no." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "How?" "Because I would have been afraid too," he said simply. Anyone who was not afraid of that number was not paying attention. He looked back at the sky. Being afraid and doing it anyway is not the same as being brave in the stories. In the stories, brave people are not afraid. In real life, brave people are afraid, and they do it anyway. And then sometimes they are sick behind the shed. He paused. That is less poetic but more accurate. She laughed, which felt good in the rain. "I need to go check the drainage channel," she said. "On the Voss parcel side. I want to see what the flow is doing now." "Tomorrow," he said, "when the rain settles. Tonight you should eat something and sleep." She started to argue and stopped, because he was right, and arguing with Matthias when he was right was a waste of both their time. She went home. She ate. She slept better than she had in 3 months. The drainage channel on the eastern side was running full by Sunday morning. She walked the fence line of her property at 7, watching the water coming down from the Voss parcel strip into her basin, and she could see it plainly now, the evidence of what had been done. There was a point approximately 200 feet up the channel where the natural flow narrowed through a clay berm that had not been there in April. She had never been onto the Voss parcel, but she could see the berm clearly from her fence line, and she could see that the rain had partially eroded it, and she could see the difference in water volume between above and below that point. She stood there for a long time, looking at it, with the rain still coming down lightly and the water running around her boots. Then she went home and wrote a letter to Abelson. She described what she'd seen, with measurements, with compass directions, with the approximate dimensions of the berm as observed from her property line. She told him she had documentation of the basin drop since late June, the timing of which correlated exactly with the period after the Voss parcel was acquired. She asked him what, if anything, could be done. He wrote back in a week. The letter was long by his standards, 3 full pages, and it laid out the situation with the same precise specificity he'd used at the hearing. What had been done to the channel was, in his legal opinion, interference with a recorded water right, which was an actionable tort. The evidence she had was circumstantial, but consistent and well documented. A civil action was possible. It would take time and money, and there was no certainty of outcome. The last paragraph said, "Before proceeding, I would ask you to consider what you actually want from such an action. If it is monetary compensation, the calculation is uncertain. If it is a legal record establishing that what was done was wrong, that is more achievable. If it is simply that it not happen again, the hearing record and this documentation, combined, may be sufficient deterrent without further action. I leave the decision to you, as it is yours to make." She read it 3 times. She thought about what she wanted. This was the question that turned out to be harder than she expected, because the honest answer was not as simple as she'd assumed. She wanted Blackwell to face a consequence for what he'd done. That was real, and she was not going to pretend it wasn't. She was not a person who felt nothing about what he'd attempted. The slow, patient, calculated effort to drain her land and starve her birds, and manufacture a desperation that would make her grateful for whatever number he put on the table. She felt it. It made her angry in a way that didn't go away just because the hearing had gone right. But she also knew, and this was the part she had to be honest about, that a civil suit would cost time she needed for other things, and money she'd rather spend on her flock's second breeding season, and attention she wanted to put into the valley rather than into a courtroom. She knew that being right was not the same as being right and winning, and that winning in court and losing 2 years of her life to the process was a trade she was not sure she wanted to make. She sat with the question for 4 days, not avoiding it, working with it, the way she'd worked with the egg temperature and the basin levels and the market calculations, checking it from different angles, being honest when she was being motivated by emotion rather than judgment. On the 5th day, she went to see Henderson, not because he was a lawyer or because he had particular expertise, but because in the last 6 months, Walt Henderson had become, without either of them formally deciding this, someone whose thinking she trusted. He was not a dramatic thinker. He was a practical one. He had been a rancher for 20 years and had made and lost things and rebuilt. And he thought about problems the way you think about land. Not what it should be, but what it is, and what can actually be done with it. He was in his barn when she arrived, doing the kind of maintenance work that had replaced the ranching work since he'd sold the cattle. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. "What does Abelson think you can get?" he asked. "He doesn't know. He said monetary compensation is uncertain. So it might be nothing, after years and cost." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "What would it cost Blackwell to defend?" She hadn't thought about this angle. "More than he'd expect," she said slowly. "Abelson is not expensive, but he's very good and very specific. And the documentation I have is—" She paused. "It's thorough. It would take significant resources to explain away." Henderson nodded. "So a suit would cost you time and money with uncertain outcome, but it would cost him more than he's used to spending on something that's already failed." He straightened up. "Sometimes the right move isn't to win. It's to make the cost of fighting you higher than the value of what he'd get." She looked at him. "You think I should file?" "I think you should file and let Abelson be extremely specific and thorough in discovery," he said. "Not to win everything. To make it expensive enough that walking away looks like the better option to him." He picked up his tool again. Men like that don't respond to being wrong. They respond to cost-benefit. She drove home thinking about cost-benefit and about what Matthias had said at the very beginning. He is a patient man. Those are sometimes harder to deal with. She thought about patience as a weapon and about what it looked like when someone more patient turned it back around. She wrote Abelson that evening and told him to proceed. Well, she did not hear directly from Blackwell again. What she heard, through Vera Such, who heard it through the specific channels that Vera Such alone maintained, was that the civil filing had landed on Blackwell's desk in Mill Haven and that his reaction had been, Vera's word, delivered with her characteristic precision, unpleasant. What she heard 2 weeks after that was that Harlan Voss had quietly listed the Eastern Strip parcel for sale. What she heard, a month after the filing, was that Blackwell's attorney had contacted Abelson about a settlement. The settlement negotiation took 3 weeks, and she was not in the room for any of it, which was correct. Abelson was in the room, and Abelson was, as Henderson had predicted, very specific and very thorough. And the number that came back was not enormous, but was real, enough to cover the cost of the legal action, a documented acknowledgement of the drainage interference, and a covenant attached to the Voss parcel deed restricting any future modification of the Eastern Channel. She signed it on a Tuesday morning in Abelson's office in Harmer, and Abelson said, "That covenant is the most valuable part of this document. It runs with the land regardless of who owns it." "I know," she said. "It means even if Voss sells—" "I know," she said again. He looked at her. "You're not satisfied," he said. She considered. "I'm satisfied," she said. She stopped. I wanted him to have to say it out loud, in a room, to people. She looked at the signed documents. "That's not a legal concept." "No," Abelson agreed. "It's a human one." He gathered the papers. "The hearing record in Harmer has his name attached to the complaint, indirectly. People who look will see it." He paused. "People in this valley look." She thought about Vera Such, who knew everything about everyone, and had spent 40 years making sure that relevant information reached people who needed it. She thought about the hearing room, and the commission chairman's face when Vera had said the thing about his brother-in-law and the hay supply, and the specific quality of silence that had followed. "Yes," she said. "They do look." She drove home. The valley was different in October, cooler, the sky back to its normal depth of blue after months of that drained white, the grass starting to recover along the creek lines where water had come back. Things were not restored. It would take more than one good rain to undo a summer like that one. But there was a quality to the light and the ground that was different from August, a quality she could only describe as trying, which was not nothing. Her flock was different too. 162 birds had reached full market weight over the course of September and October, and she had sold them, not all at once, not through any single exchange or middleman, but bird by bird and group by group through a network of direct arrangements that she had built, without planning to build it, over 6 months of fair trades and honest dealings. The Hendersons took 12. The Barkers settled their advance. 3 families from the north side of the valley who she'd met at the hearing had placed orders, and she'd filled them at prices that were fair to everyone and good for her. A restaurateur from Harmer had heard about the flock through someone who'd been at the hearing and sent a letter asking about bulk purchase, and she'd spent an afternoon going back and forth on numbers with Abelson translating the contractual language. And that deal alone had covered the settlement costs and the grain debt she still owed Matthias. She paid Matthias on a Wednesday morning in late October. She showed up at his barn with a ledger notation in cash, the full amount, plus the interest she'd calculated herself, which he had not asked for. He looked at the cash and then at her. "I said grain for geese." "Grain for geese and interest," she said. "You lent money when I had nothing. That's worth more than the face value." He was quiet for a moment. "Keep the interest," he said. "Matthias, keep it," he said more firmly. "Put it toward your second breeding season." He folded his hands. "I do not need the interest. I needed you to succeed. Those are not the same thing." She looked at him. This man who had appeared at her fence line in the sedge on an April morning and brought beeswax and blankets and a thermometer and sat on a dirt floor with her at 2 a.m, listening for tapping on the inside of a shell. Who had told her how to say no to Blackwell and how to go into a hearing room, and who had said, standing in the rain, "Brave people are afraid and they do it anyway, and then sometimes they are sick behind the shed." Thank you, she said. It came out more quietly than she intended, and with more weight than those two words usually carry, and they both understood what it covered. He picked up his coffee cup. Sit down, he said. I made real coffee. She sat down. 25 birds she kept for breeding stock. She had planned on 20 pairs but ended up with 25 because there were 5 she could not bring herself to sell. And she was honest enough with herself to admit that the reason was not rational. She simply knew those birds, had watched them hatch, had a specific recognition of their individual patterns that made them feel different from the others in a way she couldn't articulate to anyone without sounding foolish. Henderson's son, when she told him she was keeping 25, said, "Which ones?" Without any irony, because he had spent 4 months naming them and had opinions about which ones were the best birds, and his opinions were actually not wrong. And she kept 3 of his choices in her final selection and did not tell him this was intentional. He had turned 17 in September. She had noticed, without making a production of it, that he spent more time at the sink than the twice-weekly arrangement technically required. He had started arriving before she was up sometimes, and she'd find him already doing the morning feeding, having learned the routine so thoroughly that she sometimes couldn't tell from the results whether she'd done it or he had. She did not know what to do with this, so she did what she usually did with things she didn't know how to handle. She left it alone and watched what happened. What happened was that one morning in early November, he arrived and instead of starting the feeding, he stood at the edge of the basin and waited for her to come out, which was different. "I wanted to ask you something," he said when she came out with her coffee. "Ask?" she said. He looked at the basin. "My dad's going to try again in the spring. Cattle, probably. Buy a small starter herd when prices come down. But there's going to be a gap. He won't have income until next fall at the earliest." He paused. "I was thinking about whether it made sense to—" He stopped and started again. "I know you're planning a second breeding season. I thought maybe there was work here. Regular work that I could do." She looked at him. He was 17 and serious and had been doing the work without asking for 6 weeks, which was his version of making the case before making the argument. "What does your father think?" she said. "He thinks I should ask." "What do you think you should be paid?" He told her a number. It was low. She could see that he'd set it low because he was afraid she'd say no, and she recognized that tactic because she'd used it herself, on Abelson, when she'd been afraid of the number. She told him a different number. Higher. He blinked. "That's more than I asked." "I know what the work is worth," she said. "I don't pay less than that." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him adjusting to the unexpected version of this conversation, the one where someone gave you more than you asked for without requiring you to negotiate for it. "All right," he said. "You learn everything," she said. "Breeding, incubation, pasture management, market calculation, direct sale. If you're going to work here, you're going to understand the whole operation." "All right," he said again, and now there was something in his face that was not just relief, but genuine interest, the specific light of someone who has found a thing they want to learn. "What's your name?" she said. He looked at her. "You don't know my name?" "I know your last name is Henderson. I've been calling you Henderson's son in my head for 6 months. He stared at her for a moment and then laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. "Eli," he said, "Eli Henderson." "Eli," she said, "come inside, I'll show you the breeding records." November moved into December, and the valley did what valleys do after a drought breaks. It recovered unevenly and unglamorously, with some things coming back faster than others, and some things not coming back at all. Henderson started planning his spring herd with the careful, modest ambition of a man who has learned what overextension costs. Cleet Burrows' feed store started seeing more traffic as operations cautiously rebuilt. The Barker family replanted their south field for a winter crop, and the Pendleton children came home from their relatives in the east. Not everything was fixed. The Kellerman family that Matias had mentioned, the ones who'd sold their land to Blackwell years ago at a low price when they needed cash, they didn't come back. Some losses are structural. Some gaps in a community are the shape of people who left and didn't return, and the people who remain adjust around the shape without ever quite filling it. Rowan had learned this about loss in general. It doesn't resolve, it just becomes familiar, and familiar is different from healed. Blackwell's name came up less and less as winter settled in. He had other operations, other valleys, other calculations running. The settlement covenant was filed with the county deed office and attached to the Voss parcel, and the parcel itself sold in November to a family from the eastern part of the state who wanted to run a small goat operation. Rowan introduced herself to them at the feed store in December, and they were young and slightly overwhelmed and not at all aware of the history of the land they'd bought, and she looked at them and thought, good. They didn't need to carry that. It was over and filed and covenanted and done. The Water and Land Commission restructured its conflict of interest disclosure requirements in January, quietly, without announcement, in the minutes of a regular meeting that almost nobody attended. Vera Such attended. She mentioned it to Rowan the next time Rowan came to the post office, in the same tone she used for everything, which was the tone of a woman stating facts in the knowledge that facts are more durable than opinions. "Does that mean Fitch had to resign?" Rowan asked. "He chose not to seek reappointment," Vera said, "which is a different thing, in the same direction." Rowan thought about this. "Is that enough?" Vera considered with genuine seriousness. "No," she said, "but it's more than there was before, and more than there was before is what most changes actually look like." She sorted a stack of envelopes. The people who wait for it to be completely fixed usually miss the part where it gets slightly better, which is the part they could have helped with. Rowan looked at her. Vera went on sorting envelopes with the air of someone who has said the thing she meant to say and is now done with it. "Mrs. Such," Rowan said, "did you know, in April, when I came in for the first time, what I was going to try to do?" Vera looked up. "No," she said. "You didn't know yet either. But you started routing information to me, the Henderson family, the creek level. I route information to people who look like they're paying attention," Vera said. "You looked like you were paying attention." She went back to the envelopes. "That was all. The rest was yours." Rowan walked home with her mail and thought about that. About the difference between being helped and being handed something. About the specific value of information reaching the right person at the right time. And about how Vera Such had understood, without needing it explained, that what Rowan needed was not assistance but material. The raw data of what was actually happening in the valley, delivered to someone who would know what to do with it. She thought about all the things that had built the things she'd built, and how almost none of them had looked at the time like building. They had looked like responding, adjusting, making the trade that made sense, saying no to the thing that was wrong and yes to the thing that was possible, and sometimes throwing up behind the shed in between. She had not set out to save a valley. She had set out to survive on land nobody wanted. The valley had come later, not as a plan, but as a consequence. The consequence of choosing, over and over, to make trades that were fair on both sides, rather than trades that only worked in her favor. The consequence of Matias saying worthless is what people call things they don't understand how to use, and of her believing him, and of acting on it before she had any evidence that she should. The second breeding season began in February. She had 25 birds, a repaired and expanded brooder, a secondary water source that had performed exactly as designed through the winter, a written operation manual that Eli had helped her create from her notebooks, because he had turned out to be someone who thought in systems, who looked at her scattered records and saw immediately that they should be organized differently, and had done it with her over a series of evenings at the kitchen table in December. She had 3 standing sale agreements for the fall. The Harmer Restaurateur, a buyer from the next county who'd heard about her birds through the hearing network, and Cleet Burrows, who had decided to start carrying dressed goose alongside the feed supplies, and had asked if she could provide a regular supply. She had told him she could, and then gone home and calculated whether she could, and the answer was yes, barely, if the second hatch went as well as the first. She had Eli, who arrived every morning at 5:45 and could now do everything she could do except the market negotiation, which she was teaching him separately because it was a different skill from animal management and required a different kind of confidence, the kind that comes from knowing your numbers cold and trusting them when someone tries to pressure you off them. "What if they offer less than cost?" he asked one morning while they were going over the pricing calculations at the kitchen table. "Then you say no," she said. "What if they really need the birds?" She looked at him. "Eli, if they really need the birds and they can't pay cost, you come talk to me and we figure out an arrangement. What you don't do is sell below cost without telling me, because that comes out of both our futures." She paused. "There's a difference between flexibility and letting people make your decisions for you." He nodded, frowning at the numbers in the way he did when he was memorizing something. "How do you know which one you're doing?" "You usually know," she said. "You just don't always listen to yourself." He wrote something in the margin of the calculation sheet. She didn't ask what it was. Matias came over that evening, as he often did now, not at set times, but with the regularity of someone who has found that a neighboring property has become a place where evenings are better than his own barn. He and Eli had developed a specific relationship that Rowan found difficult to characterize. Matias was not warm toward the boy, but he asked him questions that nobody else asked him, about things like irrigation and soil composition and the mechanics of water movement, questions that treated him as someone with knowledge worth accessing. Eli answered them with a seriousness that was different from how he talked to everyone else. It was the seriousness of being taken seriously, which is something you can feel when it happens and which leaves a mark. They were talking about the spring water table when Rowan put coffee on the table and sat down and looked at the two of them, the 70-something man with the uneven beard and the alert pale eyes, and the 17-year-old with the notebook full of calculations and the 5 geese he'd named against her expressed preference. And she felt something that took her a moment to identify. Ordinary. It felt ordinary, not in a diminished sense, in the sense of a thing that has become reliable, a thing you can build on because it will be there when you come back to it. She had spent most of her adult life before April without anything that felt like that, reliable in the particular way of people rather than objects, warm and imperfect and present for reasons that were not transactional, even when the transactions between them were real. She had thought, when she came to Caldwell Flats with $83 and a tilted shed, that the question was whether she could survive on land nobody wanted. That had been the wrong question, or not wrong exactly, but incomplete. The real question was not whether she could survive, because surviving was the floor, not the ceiling. The real question was what you built, on the other side of surviving, that made the surviving worth it. She was looking at part of the answer. She was not going to say this out loud because she was not a person who said things like that out loud. And also because Matias was currently explaining something about spring groundwater recharge to Eli using a diagram he was drawing with his finger on the table surface, which would need to be wiped down later, and she didn't want to interrupt. She drank her coffee. Outside, her flock settled into the night sounds that she knew as well as her own breathing now. The low, conversational murmur of birds who are comfortable where they are. Her basin sat at its proper full level, rain restored and holding. The eastern channel ran clear. The covenant on the Voss parcel was filed in Harmer and would be there, attached to that land, long after she was finished caring about it. Spring was 6 weeks away. She had 25 breeding birds and a good second hatch ahead of her, and an operation that was small but real and built on decisions she could stand behind. She had a 17-year-old employee who had named 5 of her geese and would never, she suspected, entirely stop doing things like that. She had a 70-year-old neighbor who brought beeswax and blankets to women who were trying impossible things and who had said, standing in rain, "Brave people are afraid and they do it anyway." She had 10 acres of wet, marshy, low ground that the whole town of Caldwell Flats had called worthless. She had never thought it was worthless, not because she was wiser than everyone, and not because she had some gift for seeing what others missed. She had been afraid and broke and running out of options, and the land was what she had, and so she had looked at it as hard as she could and asked what it actually was rather than what everyone said it was. That was all. That was the whole secret, if there was one. You look at the thing as hard as you can. You ask what it actually is. You find the person who knows what to do with it, and you listen to them. You do the work 3 times a day, even when nothing is happening yet. You say no to the offer that isn't right, even when your hands are shaking. You make the trade that's fair on both sides. You let people help you, and you help them back, and you keep careful records of both. And you wait, because the eggs don't hatch any faster for your wanting them to, and the rain comes when it comes. And most of what happens to you is going to be the consequence of what you decided to do with your hands, and your time, and your $83 on the days when you didn't know yet whether any of it was going to work. She had not known. She had been afraid and tired and wrong about some things. She had undersold to the Barkers when she should have found a better arrangement, and she had been naive about Blackwell until Matias corrected her, and she had wasted 3 weeks being angry about the commission letter when she could have been building her case. She was not the hero of a clean story. She was a person who had done mostly the right things and some wrong ones, and had been helped at the right moments by people who had their own reasons for helping and who had tried to deserve it. Matias was still drawing on the table. Eli had his notebook out now and was copying the diagram into it with the focused speed of someone who does not want to lose the information. Rowan got up and refilled all 3 cups. The recharge rate is going to be higher this year, Matias was saying, because the ground cracked so badly over the summer. More surface area for water to penetrate. Your basin will fill faster in spring than it did last year. Which means the grass comes up earlier, Eli said, which means the flock can go to pasture earlier. Matias tapped the table diagram. Less supplemental feed in March. You save on cost. Eli wrote this down. Then he looked up. How do you know all this? Matias picked up his coffee. I have been watching this ground for 22 years, he said. And before that, I watched different ground in a different country for 30. He drank. You watch something long enough, it starts to tell you things. Eli thought about this. What was the ground like there? Where you came from? Matias was quiet for a moment. Different, he said. Drier, older. He set the cup down. But ground is ground. It wants the same things everywhere. Water and time and someone paying attention. Rowan looked at her basin through the window, dark now in the winter evening, holding its level. Water and time and someone paying attention. She had come to the sink with none of those things secured. She had the time because she had nothing else. She had found the water, had always had the water, had just needed to understand what she had. And the attention she had brought herself from the beginning, before she knew what she was paying attention to, because it was the only tool she arrived with. It turned out to be enough. Not easily, not cleanly, not without throwing up behind the shed and sitting in the dirt road and spending 3 weeks sleeping on top of an egg bed because the temperature couldn't be trusted to hold without her. Not without Matias and Eli and Vera Such and Abelson and 23 people in a low-ceilinged room in Harmer. Not without all of that. But enough. She wiped the table diagram before it dried into the wood, and Matias pretended not to notice, and Eli drew a cleaner version in his notebook for reference, and the flock settled outside into the quiet of a winter night, and the basin held its level, and the valley beyond it was sleeping and would wake up in spring, and there was work to do. There was always work to do. She picked up her coffee and her notebook, and she started on the breeding records, and the lamp burned warm on the table between them, and none of them said anything for a while,